Hello, Professor Didi here, talking today regarding international relations, security theory, and practice. I'm going to read you a quote, and at times people don't know who it is, but this time in history, it was a name that was very familiar to people. The central point is what this war is doing to the United States itself, in terms of its potential to influence world history, what it's doing to us around the world today. This draining of material and moral resources of the country from our really pressing problems. It's the old Roman problem. They're policing the Mediterranean world as Rome decays at home. That quote came from 1968 by Senator Eugene McCarthy talking about Vietnam. Power is something we hear about all the time in international relations. It's defined as the ability of one state to make another continue a course of action, change what it's doing, or refrain from acting. A powerful state has the capability to control others. Nations have always been preoccupied with security and power. Preserving it remains a duty of leaders. Economic power can be used in a variety of ways. It can reduce or eliminate trade and investment, or threaten to do it, offer trade and investment opportunities, or use natural resources as a leverage against those who need those resources. And when we think of natural resources, we often think of that three-letter word. It's called oil. Economic sanctions are also a method used as far as dealing with international threats. Great powers are well positioned to deal with this and to do this and wield this threat. These include barriers to trade. It includes withdrawal of investments, seizures of government assets and foreign bank accounts, putting penalties on people involved in actions we don't like. Think about the Ukraine and Putin. There's some advantages to this. As a low-cost alternative to going full board into war, in many ways it allows the great powers to flex their economic strength to achieve security gains. And that's why a lot of nations choose to do this. Instead of sending troops in, let's economically squeeze people dry first. States with growing populations and economic needs will seek more resources, which creates the potential for conflict and raises the risk of armed aggression. With the end of the Cold War, leaders have come under pressure to address economic, environmental, and cultural aspects of security. Another aspect of power is the expression soft power. It was coined by political scientist Joseph Nye. Soft power refers to a state's ability to get other countries to do what it wants. Soft power is the state's ability to attract allies through the legitimacy of its policies and underlying values. To gain and maintain power, states must cooperate and coordinate with other players and consider economic security. When we think about this today, we often think of the oil. And we also think when we think of power, getting people to do things we want them to do. States with monopoly on natural resources like oil use that power to get their way. China provides cheap labor, and that's a source of power. Military power is the thing we often think of when we think of power overall. It can be used to coerce, defend, or deter. The threat of using military power will often scare people. When the Ukraine war was first getting underway, people thought Putin would roll into the Ukraine quickly because of the perception of power. But the tricky thing is with military power, until you use it, people don't know if really you have the military power or not. The number of military personnel, when we think about it, troops on the ground and boots on the ground, and things like that. But sometimes it can omit factors when looking at power. Having a lot of troops, but how well are they trained, like the Iraqi army in 2003. North Korea spends a lot of money on its military, very little on its people. But we really don't know and don't want to find out how good their weapons and troops are. A state is often not considered a global military power unless it has nuclear weapons. At one time in the mid-1980s, the world probably had about 70,000 nuclear weapons. Today, it's estimated that it probably has about 15,000. There are 9 countries that are official members of the nuclear club. They are the United States, Russia, France, Great Britain, China, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea, along with Iran, and almost 20 other states and terrorist groups. are seeking nuclear capabilities. A nuclear winter would destroy all life on Earth. Since the 1930s, the global North and South have been spending on weapons. It's exceeded and increases the world's population growth as these weapons have become more and more. It also increases global insecurity as more weapons are around the world. And countries, they make these weapons to defend themselves, but then when the weapon becomes obsolete, they sell it. And the security issue is who's buying. As a nation's power increases, one might expect it to feel more secure. But history shows the reverse is true. The security dilemma involves states increasing each other's insecurity by taking measures to bolster their own security. Realists believe it makes sense for states to arm itself because of the risk of preparing for armed conflict. Liberals feel diplomacy is the solution to the security dilemma. After the Cold War, more attention has been given to security threats like population pressures, environmental pollution, and terrorism. The guns versus butter debate looks at the trade-offs between military spending and social development. One aspect when talking about international relations is the concept of compellence. Attempts to force an adversary to reverse or undo some action that's already been taken. Basically convince somebody, you've already started this action, change your mind and stop. It's almost always more difficult than deterrence because you must force an opponent to give something back they already have gained. A perfect example is the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Russians already had the troops and weapons in Cuba, but we convinced them, you got to get them out. The U.S. used its nuclear superiority to often compel countries to do certain things. Brinksmanship is a strategy the North Koreans have used, a strategy of deliberately threatening various parties with nuclear destruction to the brink of war to get their way. The U.S. policy of mass retaliation by Eisenhower during the Cold War led to arms buildups in the Soviet Union. The United States basically said, you attack us, we're just going to go all in and destroy you. Coercive diplomacy employs threats or limited force to persuade an opponent to stop or undo an action already taken. This is like recalling an ambassador or terminating cultural exchanges. Deterrence is a very popular form of the use of power. It attempts to prevent war by discouraging an aggressor from making threats, retaliation, or punishment so that the likely odds of attacking will exceed any gain. Think about the word deter in deterrence. Deterrence is associated with nuclear weapons, but it can be used with conventional weapons. Or on the personal level, a credible threat. Do this or else. Think of the mob. Deterrence requires a commitment to punish or retaliate. In other words, you've got to be willing to say, okay, we'll carry out the threat. The threat of a nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis shifted the policy to deterrence. It requires a second strike capability. In other words, after you attack the first time, do you have enough to attack the second time? It also accelerated the arms race. The superpowers developed more ICBMs, submarine-launched missiles, and a variety of other things, believing these things could not be deployed all in a first strike attack. Another common theory during this time was known as MAD, mutual assured destruction. In other words, what would deter people from going to war against each other would be knowing that basically the world would end. In the 1980s, people even talked about the possibility of fighting a limited nuclear war, which would not work. The Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, known as Star Wars, sought to make ballistic missiles obsolete by defending against them. Many people felt deterrence increased world tension. Today, conservatives hate it because the threat is not good enough. They want to see action. But to do deterrence, you have to have a commitment to punish someone. You have to have the capability to do something and be able to say, you know what, we're going to do this. And you also have to have the credibility. In other words, people thinking, yeah, they'll do it. Another aspect when it comes to power is political will, the will to actually do it. The third element of power is this. Resolve can act as a means of defense and deterrence. Great powers have no advantage in will. Hostilities cannot end as long as the enemy has the will. In Vietnam, they were willing to fight to the last man. A common strategy in conflict is to attack political will directly. The September 11th attacks were motivated by bin Laden's belief that the United States wouldn't be able to take an attack like that we would give in. Instead, the opposite happened. A couple types of war I want to mention. Interstate war, fought to gain or protect territory from another country, or the guard against a rising challenge to spread or reject an ideology. If you want to think about this, it's a little bit with the Ukraine and Russia in 2022. Intrastate war, internal wars inside countries, usually fought over resources between a couple different groups of people. One of the last things I want to talk today about is the military-industrial complex. A lot of people wonder, well, why do we have so many weapons? Why do we have all this defense spending? Defense spending creates jobs, because not only do you have a defense plant somewhere, you have people who work near the defense plant. You also have people who shop near the defense plant. You close down defense plants, you lose a lot of jobs. Military-industrial complex is a relationship between governments, armed forces, and the industry in building and developing the U.S. national defense and security policy. President Eisenhower used this term in the farewell address he gave to the nation on January 17, 1961. He said, "A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction." The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. Ike said we recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend the grave implications. Our toil, resources, livelihood are all involved, and so is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwanted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for a disastrous rise in misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper that get it. Power is an important element in international relations. The will to use it, the ability to use it, bluffing, not bluffing, whether to take an action or not. One time, former President Obama, was criticized for not going into Syria. And someone said, well, you kind of implied you would. And Obama gave an answer, "I don't do stupid wars." And what he was trying to say is, yeah, I may have said I would do something, but that would be a bad war to get involved in. Leaders do things for a variety of reasons, and power is an important element. That's why nations want to have strong national defenses, to deter people from attacking them.